Hi, I'm Dr. Anna Baranowsky, and I'm here with Dr. Gail Brenner. She's a psychologist, and she is the author of several books, but the one that I've got today is Suffering is Optional, which is a really great title. And I want to read the rest of the title on the book because it comes from a slightly different place. A spiritual guide to freedom from self-judgment and feelings of inadequacy. And I'm just wondering, Gail, it's a really interesting idea that it's a spiritual guide to freedom. And I wonder, like, how you tie these things together. What do you have in your vision that ties spirituality and suffering and freedom from all of that?
So the approach is about bringing our attention in to the very experience of suffering so that we can investigate it with the eyes of truth to see. We go outside of the story of suffering, which is what people often get caught up in. And I'm interested in what happens in the moment when someone is suffering. Like, what feelings are coming up? What's happening in their body? What thoughts are running through their mind? What beliefs are they living under in that moment? And spirituality, by bringing that perspective in, gets to the very nature of personal identity. Like, how do we define ourselves and identify ourselves? So, for example, someone who feels inadequate, for most people, that's like an overarching identity that affects many areas of their lives. And so I want to get right to the core of that identity to figure out how they get caught in it, and then the knowing of all the pieces of it and taking it apart in its components so that we can really see what's going on in the moment gives the opportunity to bring tools and insights into that moment so that the person can find freedom from that identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really beautiful. I also find that it's really easy to get locked into a place where themes kind of run our lives, and in those themes we can become very rigid around how and what we do, how we see the world around what we do, how we see general interactions with other people. So that's lovely. But now go back to the spiritual piece, because I get that you're unpackaging something, but what does it have to do with spirituality?
Well, spirituality, in the way that I'm using that word, is about something bigger than our personal selves. It's about not taking the world as we see it at face value, but questioning everything. And when we do question everything, we start to see that there's something beyond our ideas of our personal selves. There's some, like when we're really in the moment with every ounce of our being, there's a certain sense of aliveness that's here. There's something beyond any problems we might have or any thoughts that we have about ourselves that are limiting in some way. And we can potentially get a taste of something that's greater than all of that, that's almost undefinable in words, and a feeling and a sense that we get. So when we can taste and tap in to that something that I call it in the book awareness or consciousness or aliveness that's beyond all of our ideas about things, then we're expanding our consciousness beyond just our thoughts and our stories, and we're available to something bigger, and really it's the gateway to finding inner peace.
Wow, that's very profound and very lovely. And it certainly resonates for me in terms of what I see. Sometimes I ask people in the work that I do if they can connect with a sense of a place where they feel they're okay, even though all these really tough things have happened.
Yeah.
And, inevitably, if they really take the time, and I have some different exercises that I use to help them find that, if they take the time, they can find this kind of essential place that just is. And actually it always was. And
Yes.
it's very reassuring. So I think that's what you're tapping into, and it makes me really happy to speak to you, because as a psychologist, I know that you probably had to work hard to get to that understanding, because for anybody trained as a psychologist, you're a clinical psychologist,
I
right?
am.
So anybody trained as a clinical psychologist, it's a scientist practitioner background and training, and generally that kind of essential thinking isn't taught in your psychology courses. So I'm wondering how you got to this understanding, because it's a very important understanding, and it's profound, and I think it's really important, Gail, what you're doing, what you're speaking to.
And for me, it's the most healing thing. We can try to analyze the past and come up with a better story and change our thoughts and, some of those kind of common psychological techniques that we find when we go to therapy. But really getting to the absolute core of the problem is what really heals people. To understand that, to unpack that, as you said, and to know that there are options. There are other ways than the way of suffering. And I came to this, of course, not by my training, like you didn't either.
Yeah.
And it really is a parallel to my own spiritual path. It goes back a little over 20 years ago. And I just, I had my own variety of suffering that I was experiencing in my own personal life. And first I started reading about Buddhism, and I eventually found other perspectives on this spiritual path that really resonated with me at a deep level. And it was always about this inner investigation of myself. So I don't talk about anything that I don't already know in my own experience. So there's definitely a parallel to my own path. And then once some of the realizations came to me, and I started figuring out how it was possible to not suffer in any given moment, it was impossible not to bring that into my work and to my clients, because I felt like I had found something really super useful for people, and I of course wanted to bring that to them to be helpful.
In the book it says, I can't do it, I'm too damaged, it won't work, I'm a loser. Do you believe self-defeating thoughts like these that tell you something is wrong with you? Suffering is Optional offers 4 guiding principles and 5 core practices based in deep spiritual wisdom to help you discover that these self-sabotaging beliefs just aren't true. With powerful exercises, heartfelt reflections, and inspiring stories, you'll shed your false and limiting sense of self and come home to your natural aliveness that is already whole, peaceful, and primed for joy. And by the way, just so you know, I tried out one of those exercises, and I just think it's really lovely, and I would actually encourage people to go to your website and actually try out some of the exercises that you've got posted, because they open little doorways. They're like little keys.
Yeah.
So they are very, very sweet and worth practicing, worth trying out.
And I want to say even more than worth it, like necessary, because you can read every book that's published, but until you bring these ideas into your own experience and you start to play with them and you start to do little experiments to see, what if I look at it this way, or what if I don't believe that, or what if I whatever, to begin to experiment in your own experience in the moment. That's the way these insights come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I believe that there is such an important thing about that. The one thing that I do find to be true is that for a lot of people, there needs to be some kind of guidance.
Mm-hmm.
Doing these exercises can be very frightening when people start to lean towards the place where pain is alive. And there's a tendency for recoiling. So that's why I think it's so lovely that you're speaking to this issue that I think needs to have a voice, that
Mm-hmm.
just this way of moving towards these places of pain rather than recoiling or shutting down. So thank you for raising the conversation about that. I want to reference something that you wrote in your book. You say, conditioned thoughts and feelings are familiar are familiar.
That they're not true. It means that they're not an accurate description of who we really are.
Ah, beautiful.
That's what true means. So it's not false. I mean, they are false. You can use that word. But that statement that you read is an invitation for us to go in and see, like, does that really define me? So a thought like, I'm a loser. When you live under the arch of that thought, it colors so many areas of your life. And it brings a lot of suffering to our lives. So I'm always interested in, well, let's go to the source of it. Is that actually true? And when we start to investigate these thoughts, what we begin to discover is that they're conditioned. And when I say conditioned, I mean learned. We did not come in the world thinking we're inadequate. We did not come in the world thinking we're unlovable. It's just not how we're made up. But according to the experiences that we have and in reaction to the messages that we often get in childhood, we develop these conclusions that seem so strongly like the absolute truth of who we are. And that's how we live in these sources of suffering. But the invitation here is to ask the question, like, is that really true about me? And the short answer, and I always invite people not to believe anything I say because you have to know it in your own experience. But what you find is it's just conditioned, forms running across your brain, but they aren't accurate descriptions of who you really are.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be such a spiraling loop of pain and misery that goes along with it. And we can, it's easy to look on the outside and see somebody who you really can see all their lovely qualities, telling themselves that they're useless and miserable, and it's like, well, that makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, you see the light in their eyes.
Yes. It's very easy to see it from the outside, and I see it every day in my clinic where I work with remarkable people who are working really, really hard, right? So you're kind of teasing out a different possible answer, and you go on to say, instead of looking for a way to improve my personal story, I learned to do something radically different, which was to become aware of the elements of my in-the-moment experience. So you're really giving people an opportunity to kind of look at things from a very, very different lens. I wonder if you could say a little bit about this very radical way of looking at things, in-the-moment experience, what that does.
Right. So it's a matter of taking any moment. And in sessions when I work with people, I often do kind of spontaneous guided meditation so that they can understand, like, what's the thought that's happening right now, and what is the feeling that you're experiencing, what's happening in your body. And then there are ways to work with each of those different elements. So thoughts, for example, when we recognize, and sometimes the thoughts are so conditioned we don't even realize that we're thinking them. We live under the specter of them, but we don't realize that there's actually a thought process going on. So identifying that is really important. And then we want to look at it and start asking questions. A, does that thought serve? A thought like, I'm unlovable, no one will ever care about me. Does that serve our happiness? At the core, we all want to be happy. No matter what our lives are like, no matter what we're doing, everybody wants to be peaceful and happy inside. So I start from that premise, that that's what people want and that's what's possible. And then I want to look at what's in the way of them realizing that happiness and peace that are here right now in the moment. And when that thought is running across one's mind and the attention is glued to that thought, and that's a key factor here, because our attention is so important. The reason why we're not peaceful and happy in any moment is because we don't realize that that's possible, because we're busy ruminating or worrying or thinking about how to figure out all our problems, and we're distracting ourselves from opening up into the expansiveness of the present moment. So when our attention is glued to the content of those thoughts, so those thoughts give us meaning, like it means something to me that thought says that I'm inadequate. and that's the suit that I'm going to be wearing as I go through my daily life. That's what needs to be questioned, because the content of those thoughts, when we believe it and we glue our attention to it, to that thought, we're not available to other possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very rigid place.
Yeah.
You have framed your book with 4 guiding principles and 5 core practices that seem to really link directly together, the principles and the practices. And I wonder if we could spend a little bit of time on that, and particularly I'm interested in the core practices, because they really seem to be, I think we've talked a little bit actually about the guiding principles, because they're, about conditioning, and they're about waking up to your experience, like being aware.
And also the attention, where the attention goes is really important. And one of the guiding principles is recognizing that we have the ability, when we realize it, to move our attention to different parts of our experience. We can think, and then we can stop thinking and feel a sensation. And we can notice our breathing. And it's important to know that we can move our attention around. That's like a basic, fundamental principle.
Yeah, we're big on thinking. I mean, we love our thinking things.
Yeah.
Like, we think that is all that there is, and it's just so far from what is the truth.
Yes.
And yet we're so in love with our thoughts. We believe them so implicitly. Like, it's like, of course, if I think it, it must be. But it's like, really, it's such a lot of pain and suffering in there, right? It's and it's very, very clear. I mean, and the interesting thing is, as I had mentioned before, any one of us can look at anybody and say, wow, it seems that you're saying something to yourself that I can't understand, doesn't seem true to me, it doesn't seem to have any basis. And using that example alone can actually shake somebody out of a place where they're thinking very rigidly about themselves, like a very old belief that has no basis, really. They could see it in their friend, in their cousin, in their mother, in their brother, but they can't see it in themselves.
Exactly.
They're stuck in that line of thought, right? Yeah. So I love these 5 core practices. They're actually really the friend, in their cousin, in their mother, in their brother, but they can't see it in themselves.
Exactly.
They're stuck in that line of thought, right? Yeah. So I love these 5 core practices.
It's really important to do that with compassion, because it's so easy to judge. And if we're in shame, it's so easy to feel bad about whatever we're experiencing. But this gives a different flavor to turning toward our experience, which is to do it with openness and with a sense of curiosity, like, what is this? And a sense of not knowing. Curiosity brings with it a not knowing, like, I don't, and this is actually true. Many people haven't really turned in to look at what it is. Like, they'll say, yes, I've been depressed my whole life. Well, what is that? Like, and sometimes I'll say to people, teach me how to be depressed. And then they have to go into it and define it so specifically for themselves that they can teach me how to do it. And it's really just a technique. It's a way for them to be able to understand their own experience and turn toward it. But there's no way around turning toward our experience if we want to find the peace and happiness that we know is possible for ourselves.
Yeah, I like your language, the wise and kind, because it really allows that to be a kind of a gentle leaning toward.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful. And the next one is the safe haven of being aware. And it's like, I know you probably understand this, but for some people, being aware is anything but a safe haven. It's just a terrible source of, feelings that they haven't encountered, that they don't want to encounter, that, it doesn't feel like a safe haven.
When we're aware, and let's say aware of a painful feeling, there's the feeling itself, and there's also the being aware of it. So there's actually, when we start really looking at it, there's a little gap there. There's awareness, and let's kind of make awareness a thing at this, just for our conversation. There's awareness observing. There's awareness noticing pain, noticing sadness, noticing grief. So there's the thing that's being noticed, and there's the thing that's noticing it. And the safe haven is in the thing that's noticing the pain. Because when we start to look at this pure experience of being aware, it's neutral. It doesn't have the pain in it. And that's where it's really helpful to begin to find that gap between, so that we're not completely tangled up in our feelings, but we can observe them. So that's what that means. And once we can observe our feelings, we begin, and then we go to that observing presence, which I sometimes call a loving presence. It's allowing, it's neutral, it doesn't have a problem at all, and it doesn't have a problem with what it's observing. And once we begin to really feel into that, it begins to feel like a safe place from which we can explore the painful experiences that we have.
Right, that's a very subtle place, and I think it requires that people actually have the training to know how to sit with that kind of observer position.
Yeah. I mean, it's a meditation instruction, for people who know meditation. I mean, there are many kinds of meditation, but one of the ways is to be with what is and observe it.
So I think you have quite a few meditations on your website. Is there one particularly that you want to send me that we could link to this video so that people have that?
I will send you two, actually.
Okay.
So there's one on breathing, because we haven't talked about that yet, but taking a conscious breath is a really important practice. And then there's another one about exploring our experience. So I will send you two.
Oh, beautiful. Okay. Yeah. Now the next one is losing interest in thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to be more, that is the name of the chapter, but I want to be more specific about it. It's losing interest in the content of the thought. So imagine that a thought is, I know this is impossible, but imagine that a thought is running through your mind in a language that you can't understand. So it's a thought, but it's kind of like blah, blah, blah going across your mind, but it doesn't have any meaning to you because you can't understand what it's telling you. Mm-hmm. But when we understand what our thoughts are telling us, that can potentially be the beginning of some trouble. Because a thought that's saying, you are a loser and you're never going to succeed in your life, and that's content, there's meaning in that, and then we apply that meaning to ourselves, and that's the beginning of the trouble. Mm-hmm. So when we lose interest in the content of our thinking, and I know for me, it was a gigantic turning point where I really got to the point where I just stopped believing all of my thoughts because I just kept seeing over and over and over, they're 99% A, not true, and B, not helpful. Oh. So I just wasn't interested in them anymore because I was way more interested in being happy.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Oh my goodness, that's lovely. Welcoming feelings.
Yeah. So feelings consist of physical sensations in the body, mm-hmm. and a story that runs through our mind about these sensations. And the story might be as subtle as a label. Like, there are sensations in the body, and I'm going to call that sadness, or I'm going to call that anxiety. And often the mind can get going and give it even more of a story, and that's because of this, and because I have this feeling I have to do that, and that makes me whatever. So we all know there's stories that can come. So I want to unwind that. I want to encourage people to unwind the story and come right into the physical sensations that are here in the moment when we have what we call a feeling. And then it's about going to that safe haven, or sometimes I think of it as a safe anchor of awareness, of being aware of physical sensations. And what people find almost across the board is that when we become aware of the physical sensations that are part of these feelings, the whole experience of the feeling It's the story about the feeling that gives the feeling that power. But when we just come down into the moment and we're breathing with some contraction in the belly and a little tension in the heart, there's no problem. That's all there is.
Yeah.
So that process of welcoming feelings is super helpful.
And clients just almost go on a hunting expedition. They might have a sensation in their body, and it actually doesn't even have a story yet.
Yeah.
But they'll go for a hunting expedition to find the answer.
Yeah.
Because we very much, incline to believe that if we have an answer, then it gives us something.
Yeah.
And yet it gives us absolutely nothing but the pain.
Right.
The increased adrenaline and cortisol and all the things that go along with it, right? Because we can have that feeling. I mean, physiologically, we can ignite for lots of different reasons. But it's only that hunt that creates the real trouble afterwards. But the realities is sometimes we experience like deep and big and true suffering in the moment. And so, the welcoming of feelings in those really deep and true, we're not talking about stuff that happened in the past that's getting re-triggered by low-level cues in this moment. We're talking about the big T trauma, something really miserable. So how do you address that?
And there has to be a great respect. This whole process is very gentle and kind and compassionate with ourselves. So sometimes it's just too much to turn toward a feeling and feel it. And then there are calming practices that we can do. If it's useful, and I know for some people it's even too much, to focus on the breath. So to just put the attention on the sensations of the inhale and the exhale and just breathe. Like I said, that's even too much. So then you might do something like naming, and the theme of all of these practices are just to be here in the present moment in a calm way. So just naming, now I see a plant, now I see a tree, now I'm at a table, now I feel this, now I feel that, and just kind of like those kinds of statements that bring us into the present moment, going directly into the overwhelming feeling. And another one is just feeling your feet on the ground. And I also like physical soothing. You hug yourself, or you take your arm, or you take your hair and you just soothe yourself. Just those kind of soothing things before it feels ready to go into these more painful and more powerful feelings.
And that's really, I mean, okay, this portion, and that's really, I mean, okay, this portion with the core practices, the final one is a sacred return. I wonder if you could explain that.
Yeah. And what I say is that it's almost not a practice. It's in the list of practices, but it's not something you do. It's something that you experience and realize once you've gone through the other practices. And I also want to say it's possible to circumvent all the practices and go there directly, but that's a little harder to do, and takes a little more experience with this whole process. But it's the knowing that once you turn toward your experience with compassion. You're not believing the thoughts. You're opening to the physical sensations, and you're just here and you're breathing. And then there's the realization that there's a sense of expansiveness, or there's a sense of okayness, or there's a sense of aliveness, or I can do this, or an inner confidence that just kind of bubbles up. These are things that appear once the contraction around this conditioned pattern starts to break up and fall away. It's the noticing of this natural naturalness of our being that's always here and available, but it was covered over by all of this other stuff that we call our normal life. But that stuff starts to fall away with these other practices, and we open to the expansiveness of the present moment. And you mentioned something about the unknown, and I want to follow up on that, because getting comfortable with the unknown is really useful, because when we stop doing what we're conditioned to do and the way we're conditioned to feel, we're in the unknown. We don't know how we're going to feel. We don't know what we're going to do. We don't know how we're going to relate to the people in our lives. So we're without this familiar conditioned pattern that really isn't serving our happiness. We're in the realm of the not knowing, and it can be scary for sure, but it's also just loaded with potential and filled with like heartful possibility.
And a lot of freedom.
A lot of freedom.
A lot of freedom, because then you're not burdened with all this negative inner chatter and belief systems that, really lock people into a very painful and rigid place. Your work is really very aligned with the way I work with clients, so it's a real delight to speak with you and to hear how you've conceptualized it, and also that you've got this very particular map, which I think is very useful, and I would encourage people to take the time to go and use the links, the videos that you're going to share with me, so that they can actually watch them and have the experience, because I think those links are very experiential.
Yes.
And I'm going to show the book again, Suffering is Optional, by Dr. Gail Brenner. And I just wonder, is there anything else that you want to share with listeners who you think would be interested in, a extra piece that you have to offer, something that pops into your mind right now?
Well, there are tons of like hundreds actually of articles on my website. It's gailbrenner.com. So people are welcome to go there and just click around and see what might be useful. And the one thing I want to say is, like, stay with the path and have hope. That no matter how much you're suffering and how fed up you are and how you might think there's no way out for you, there absolutely is. I absolutely know that the true nature of everyone is the same. And it's this expansive aliveness, this inner peace, this knowing that it's possible to be happy. And when I say happy, I don't mean like giddy happy, although that can happen, but just this fundamental sense that things are okay. And in that, there's a great deal of peace. And that is possible for every single person on earth.
That's such a good place to stop. I want to thank you so much for bringing that wisdom and kindness to this forum. And I just want to say goodbye to everybody, and wishing you a gentle day, and thanking you so much, Dr. Brenner, for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.